Well, good morning. I want to thank John and the Institute for setting this up and for inviting me here. So what I'll do in my time is I'll give a very quick overview of some of the key themes in my paper. We routinely puzzle over what to do under conditions of limited information about past, current, or future circumstances. Bastier's admonition to rise above our ignorance seems sensible, but I think his injunction needs qualification and elaboration. We face countless areas of moral and empirical ignorance, and we cannot rise above them all, at least because time is limited. And what complicates this further is that we're ignorant not just about remote moral and empirical causes and effects of our actions and inaction. We're ignorant of our ignorance, and we're ignorant of which ignorance deserves priority for remedy. So how can then people appropriately respect the moral reasons that apply to them? And in my paper, I consider some features of pervasive moral and empirical ignorance, especially in light of the real danger that we may be complicit in serious moral wrongs. And I argue that providing, or at least being disposed to provide, moral repair can in some circumstances help us to respond to the demands of moral reasons in light of this ignorance. And I conclude in the paper that responsible fears and agents do not always privilege remote, unseen goods over nearer goods. In section 2 of the paper, on conditions of responsibility, I give a brief overview of these conditions of responsibility. And the section surveys 2 leading conditions for typical findings of responsibility, and it concludes by talking about the significance of these conditions for decisions under uncertainty. Many of us are familiar with some of the debates on issues of responsibility. So when persons or institutions fail to abide by certain norms that we believe apply to them, depending on the failing, we might respond with certain reactive attitudes. And regarding a person as a responsible being typically means that we take her to be capable of recognizing and responding to reasons. And theorists will commonly note that assignments of responsibility involve some versions of at least 2 conditions, a voluntariness condition and some epistemic condition. So now consider the case of a reasonably conscientious person who is determining what she ought to do. She faces a common choice situation where she must decide under moral and empirical uncertainty. Now we might say that she has a good reason, maybe even a moral reason, to gather more moral and empirical data, but as we know, time is limited. Might she be held responsible for any harmful consequences, even wrongful harmful consequences that may issue from her choice? And a lot hangs on how much her ignorance might exculpate. So there's a section here that talks about ignorance and negative responsibility. And in this section, I note that ignorance only sometimes exculpates, but when it does so only in a range of acceptable uncertainty. And failing to remedy any particular ignorance is thus not necessarily an occasion to blame someone, even if such ignorance results in wrongful harm. So theorists talk about this issue about ignorance and whether it can exculpate. Does it relieve someone of responsibility for what she does, or at least blame for what she does? And at least some circumstances, it seems to do so. And in this section, I talk about a common example that comes up in this literature involving unwitting poisoning. And this intermediating agent is excused if she had no reason to believe that someone had tainted a beverage that she serves. There are, however, circumstances under which people will hold intermediaries, ignorant intermediaries, responsible for failing to take some greater care, such as when they've got known homicidal poisoners in their midst. This section also canvasses what George Scher calls the searchlight view of responsibility. And to simplify that a bit, this view, on Scher's take on it, mistakenly treats responsibility as only a function of whatever occupies an agent's immediate awareness. So in cases such as, this is from Scher's example, the soccer mom who distractedly bakes her dog to death in a hot minivan, people would hold her responsible and blame her. Ignorance alone then does not exculpate. Agents are sometimes blameworthy for acts that they perform in momentary, factual ignorance. Agents ignorant of facts that make a plan of conduct impermissible are thus not necessarily excused. Now, responsibility sometimes hangs not so much on the content of one's beliefs, so much as the procedures and standards one adopts regarding belief management. And many of the examples I talk about in this section discuss factual ignorance, and then I turn to whether matters might change when we start to think about moral ignorance. Gideon Rosen describes the case of an ancient slaveholder. It's not original to Rosen, but it's a good example. So the ancient slaver knows he enslaved people, but he finds there's no moral reason not to do so. And we can even imagine the unlikely case that the slaver reflects on the merits of his act. That slaver would find no reason to regard his conduct as morally wrong. He might recognize slavery is undesirable, and he might even admit that really there's nothing intrinsically about the slave that merits enslavement. It just might be a bummer for the slave. There may have also been some compelling arguments against the permissibility of slavery that might have been available to the slaver in some very abstract sense. These arguments would not be obvious, and Rosen writes, given the intellectual and cultural resources available to a second millennium Hittite lord, it would have taken a moral genius to see through the wrongness of chattel slavery. So Rosen concludes, we can, and we would, regret the tragic condition in which persons found themselves in the ancient world. It would be appropriate, however, Rosen adds, to blame the ancient slaver for the injustice of such slavery. Elizabeth Harman argues that moral ignorance might not excuse an agent when the wrongness of the act was available to him or her. So in the case of the ancient Hittite lord, what makes him culpable, she says, is his knowledge that he is enslaving someone. And she confesses, all right, this may leave people culpable for actions based on beliefs that they were epistemically justified in holding. So in this section, I talk about how, because time is precious, agents cannot always be faulted for taking an action that would have helped them to realize some remote moral value. Sometimes the costs are excessive, and sometimes the agents cannot be blamed for failing to incur the cost. A challenge is that sometimes, somewhere between the surprise poisoning and known complicity in injustice, a person becomes blameworthy and bound by stringent norms regarding moral repair. So the agent of wrongful harm might then owe compensation to victims in some way, including some measures that might attempt to offset or undo the wrongful effects. How much blame, what forms of moral repair are appropriate, all of these are, of course, very important details. The key is that there is some threshold whose boundaries might be difficult to specify, beyond which one's ignorance and false beliefs no longer excuse. And I then turn to judgments of positive moral responsibility in section 4 of the paper. This section, section 4, talks about cases of ignorance regarding assignments of praise. And I note that ignorance in only some cases can, I don't know if you want to use the term exculpate, but exculpate from praise. So the literature on ignorance typically focuses on negative responsibility, but there's very little on its impact for cases of positive responsibility. Clearly, ignorance can make someone ill-suited as a target for praise, such as ignorance of what one is doing. And this is nicely typified in a Curb Your Enthusiasm episode where Larry David has these enormous shoelaces. He goes into an airplane bathroom, comes out, and winds up tackling this belligerent drunken passenger, and everybody praises him. People were epistemically justified in praising Larry, even though he didn't deserve it. On the other hand, we sometimes praise persons despite their ignorance, and with good reason, even if their ignorance is of the moral sort. The residents of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, at great risk to themselves and their families, sheltered Jews during Vichy France. Their dedication, despite the risks, seems to illustrate precisely the sort of miracle of moral vision that Rosen says is needed when cultural resources and circumstances make upright conduct such a precious commodity. At least some of the Chambonnais, I think many of them, were animated by the view that justice required them to lend aid to the Jewish refugees. And I consider the possibility that they may very well have been morally ignorant, at least in believing that justice required them to do what they did. So we may plausibly suppose that the unfortunate counterfactual were true. Were the Chambonnais disabused of this, by hypothesis, mistaken belief that justice required them to shelter the Jews, then we can suppose they would not have sheltered the Jews. We nevertheless praise the Chambonnais, but not because they did justice. We praise them as an expression of our commitment to certain values that we share with them, such as celebrating the triumph of good over evil and acknowledging the special significance of innocent human life. And this illustrates 2 points. First one is that praiseworthiness is not a tidy function of what targets of such praise know and do. We sometimes assign praise to agents because of their role in bringing about moral value, or at least slowing the loss of moral value, even if they were ignorant of what they were doing. And the second point is that I think we now have reason to doubt Rosen's claim that reactive attitudes are inappropriate for persons who are ignorant of remote truths. We might praise or blame as an expression of the values we now hold, even if the targets of such reactive attitudes were mistaken about what they were doing, and they could not have plausibly realized their mistake. The last section talks about what this means for the ordinary persons who are deciding what to do in conditions of uncertainty, and this is particularly true of 21st century consumers who must choose in multiple contexts of limited knowledge. They can focus on what seems readily apparent in front of them, or they can explore how to ameliorate some of the ignorance they face. Their failure to remedy such ignorance is not always blameworthy. Western consumers are understandably ignorant of some of the remote causes and effects of their conduct, especially as it concerns climate change, third world manufacturing, complicity in third world political oppression, and their role in the suffering of non-human animals. These are features of prospective ignorance, and it is unclear to many reasonable persons what are the remote effects of the choices facing them. This uncertainty is retrospective as well, especially as it concerns something that occupies much of my recent research, that of historic injustice. Many persons are ignorant of how their lives and current conditions were made possible by which remote injustices. There is profound empirical and indeed moral ignorance here. Consumers might acknowledge history was oppressive and bloody, but they might not know what morality requires of them, or what it requires of their institutions for repair. Bastiat and others warn against short-sightedness. Forbearing inquiry into remote causes and effects understandably strikes many of us as lazy and dangerous, but it is surely not always so. And in the case of consumers facing such profound uncertainty, one is not obviously always blameworthy for going about one's business. Perhaps one can be a reasonably responsible agent if one avoids obvious injustice while being disposed to make up for less obvious ones should they later come to light. But I acknowledge we have to proceed very carefully here because there's a danger of rationalizing complicity in injustice, rationalizing motivated ignorance, and rationalizing just outright moral disregard. Perhaps, absent clear evidence that they risk contributing to an injustice, agents might not be blamed for not diligently eradicating their ignorance. It is hard to know how to repair one's ignorance, and it is hard to know which of the many ignorance one faces should take priority. So without saying that they should close their eyes to injustice, I begin to suggest that perhaps agents should be diligent stewards, or at least they may be diligent stewards of their moral resources, while alert for the possibility of moral improvement. They might then be readily disposed to fix their mistakes. It may be too much to ask of agents that they resolve all the moral and empirical ignorance that afflicts them. They do not know which ones to treat first. This is neither a prescription nor an excuse for blissful ignorance. It is a qualified rejection of the claim that good social theorists and morally responsible agents always seek the remote good. Sometimes, agents have reason to stick with what is seen over what is unseen. Critics will surely object that this is an underspecified excuse for all manner of injustice. If one is complicit in injustice, one ought to desist in it, and I accept that. What I deny is that such a claim implies that if one might be complicit in injustice, one ought always to find out about it. The critics surely say, look, we should seek alternatives to such lies and tread more lightly in our world. The problem is that reasonable people disagree about how to tread lightly. Such disagreement, given the familiar burdens of judgment, seems entirely reasonable. This is not to counsel or excuse moral insensitivity, it is to question the idea that responsible persons and thinkers always pursue remote goods wherever they lie. The status of some remote goods is opaque. Responsible agents might sometimes reasonably give precedence to the seen goods about which they have greater moral and practical expertise. When remote connections draw nearer, one might then provide various forms of moral repair, including apologies. This is not a way of purchasing the right to go about one's business. In other words, it's not as if one can remain morally ignorant while committing to apologize later, should it turn out not to have been avoidable, and that makes it all morally permissible. It is a commitment to moral repair when it is called for in the context of reasonably, not knowing now whether one ought to desist from current actions that might later make moral repair called for. So an apology and other moral repair one later offers need not be cheap. It can be a way of affirming shared values. It can provide the mutual accountability we often expect of one another, but in a context where we must make difficult choices under tragically bounded knowledge. Thanks, I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much.